The idea of flying off into space and leaving your homeworld behind is something that's captured the imaginations of Star Wars fans ever since the release of A New Hope. But people may not get around the Star Wars galaxy in the ways or the amount you may think. So today we're going to look at what space travel looks like in Star Wars for the regular inhabitants of the galaxy in both Legends and canon. Please don't sue me, Not Just Bikes, love your videos. But the thing about interstellar travel in Star Wars is that unless you're in a profession that requires going from planet to planet, whether that means illegal smuggling or legal transportation of goods, being a member of the military, or working on a cruise line or something, your day-to-day life probably doesn't involve traveling between planets much, if at all. When it comes to private or personal ownership of spacecraft, we don't really see a situation where families have their four-door Nissan Rogue One to fly down the hyperlane for space groceries. When we do see people who own their own spaceships for purposes other than some kind of transportation industry involvement, it's usually in one of two situations. The first is that they have a more nomadic lifestyle in general, and that ship is also their home, something which usually, but not always, goes hand in hand with professions that require that kind of mobility. So that again gets us back to the transportation industries, whether legal or illegal, and things like bounty hunting. A lot of interstellar travel takes a day or more, so most privately owned ships we see do have significant room and get referred to as yachts or luxury yachts, so not exactly the most accessible thing in the galaxy. Which brings us to our second situation, being that the person has a homeworld with a house or apartment, but is otherwise just absolutely filthy rich. This is the case with people like Han and Leia, who also fit into the professional need based on Leia's career as a politician and Han having the Falcon from his smuggling days. But there's also Lando Calrissian, who has luxury space yachts like the Lady Luck, and he just kind of flies around as he wants to because he owns every business in the galaxy at some point. We see a lot of moving between planets in stories, but that's usually because we're focusing on stories that are about some of the more powerful people in the galaxy. And in a lot of cases, when you look at the origin stories for people, it shows that they didn't really have all that much access to the stars beforehand, something we'll get to in a little bit. So what we don't often see are spacecraft which are closer to fighter size but for private use, or where you'd expect a normal person to own it for getting around the galaxy. I'm including both Legends and canon sources for this video because it's more of a common theme than a specific bit of timeline lore. But when we do see these smaller craft just for transporting people from point A to point B, where they're not also functioning as a cargo ship or a primary living space in its own right, it's from privately owned starfighters. And once again, ownership of those is limited to richer people or people who have jobs that specifically require it. We know of at least some fighter types which existed for private or personal use, like the Besh type, a modified B-Wing, but even this was still armed, intended to fall under organizational private use, so corporations might own them. We're still pretty far from your average family with 2.5 kids and a pet Nexu having one of these in their garage. And this seems to be the case regardless of where in the galaxy they're from, and whether they had the ability to like this video and subscribe for more. Even among the richer core worlds, you don't see that many people who own their own starships unless they really need it for something. Personal speeders, however, were a different story. Moisture farmers on Tatooine are hardly among the galaxy's richest socioeconomic classes, but Luke, Owen, and Beru have a speeder in Episode 4, and we hear about Luke owning a T-16 airspeeder, so having transportation like that to get around on a planet is significantly more common, even if we see a reliance on public transit in many cases still, like Obi-Wan hopping on the Senate shuttle. The traffic on Coruscant seems nowhere near as bad as you'd expect if everyone had their own speeders, which is mostly an aesthetic and budgetary choice by George Lucas, but hey, let's pretend it's because getting a pilot's license and being able to afford not just a flying speeder, but space to park, was out of reach even for many on the galaxy's richest world. And really, if you look at most stories that take place on Coruscant, it's far more common for people to walk between different areas instead of taking whatever their personal speeder might be. But Tatooine also gives us two other looks at the ways that everyday people would get around the galaxy. Tatooine was particularly out of the way and relatively poor overall, but the desire to see the galaxy or even just be a pilot was a big draw for people to join the military, especially under the Empire. Luke talks about how that's the thing he planned to do and that his friends, like the overrated pilot and mustache enthusiast Biggs Darklighter, had already done. So for a lot of people, the most convenient access to getting off of your homeworld is just joining the military, especially if you want to leave your homeworld permanently. We see this as a driving force for other worlds like Jalukin and Lost Stars as well. It's another relatively poor, relatively out-of-the-way planet, where joining the military was the only real way to satiate interstellar wanderlust. On Jellican, only the more affluent families even had airspeeders there, as we see with Thane Carell's family, but even for that relatively rich family, they had a flight simulator rather than an actual starship. And that flight simulator was how the story's two protagonists do their flight training before entering the Imperial Academy. But while interstellar travel wasn't an everyday occurrence for people, and most people didn't have the personal means to go on regular long-distance trips, that doesn't mean they were entirely cut off from it, thanks to the magic of public transit. After all, how else would people go on family vacations to Hologram Fun World, an actual name for an actual theme park in Star Wars? It's probably most accurate to think of most people's relationship with spaceflight in Star Wars as being akin to people's relationship with flying in the real world. For some people, it is relatively frequent, even if it's not something you do every single day, while for others, they may never experience it at all. But no matter where you look, it involves Harrison Ford getting into trouble with it. When Luke and Ben were looking for passage to Alderaan in Episode 4, they hired a smuggler, and it was quite expensive, but they needed to be as fast and discreet as possible. It wasn't the only option open to them. Once again, Tatooine gives us some examples of how this can work in the Book of Boba Fett. We see Din Djarin, shipless after the destruction of the Razor's Crest, taking a flight from Glavis in the core to Tatooine, a popular enough flight to be a non-stop one on a relatively sizable ship. What we don't know, of course, is how regular this or any other individual flight might be. Maybe this is the only shuttle they send every month, and that's why it's able to be non-stop But we can assume that every spaceport had a variety of different flight routes available with a variety of frequencies. In Episode 2, Anakin and Padme also take public transit back to Naboo when trying to avoid assassins, and we see Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon on public transit in Light of the Force by John Jackson Miller, interacting with regular citizens in the galaxy and getting a sense for how they feel about the Jedi, which was not altogether great. Back on the show side, in Andor Episode 4 of Season 1, we see Cyril Karn getting to Coruscant on this kind of shuttle between worlds. There are several examples of this type of interstellar shuttle being available from spaceports, in addition to their private parking across books, shows, and other media. And on top of these kinds of ships oriented towards transit, there are interstellar cruise lines as a fairly common thing in both Legends and canon. Han and Leia go on their honeymoon in the in-universe version of the Galactic Starcruiser Hotel in canon, which lasted way longer than its real-life counterpart, and in Legends, the 19-book New Jedi Order series regularly uses passenger liners and cruise liners in its subplot about refugees fleeing from captivity by the Yuuzhan Vong. These refugee storylines, as the Yuuzhan Vong capture more and more of the galaxy in the NJO, also show us a bit more information on just how rare private starship ownership was. The evacuations of Cernpedal in Vector Prime and Coruscant and Star by Star, for example, have every available starship packed to the brim with refugees simply because there are way more people than ships. People are rushing and crowding to get to whatever ships they can. And a planet like Coruscant already has pretty clogged space lanes with just necessary shipping, let alone if there was a constant flow of personal starship traffic from everyone on the planet making day trips out to Arcania. But the Falcon has to pick up dozens of people trying to escape the planets in both cases, and in both cases a full evacuation is impossible, in part because of the limited availability of starships. Of course, any massive evacuation is difficult, and even if everyone did have private ownership of their own personal starship, they wouldn't necessarily make things much easier when trying to evacuate. So yes, people could get around the Star Wars galaxy as regular citizens, but it was almost certainly a rare occurrence, like an intercontinental trip on Earth, rather than being an everyday thing people could do with their own means. The real takeaway here, though, is that Ottawa needs better public transit. Either way, thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the video.